Hello, folks, and welcome to the Vertigo Tea Party and another tea time. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic brought to me by a Patreon gauge. The topic's discussion is going to be game mechanics that sounded good, like in theory or on paper, but in practice turned out to be not quite so interesting. The example he gave, I think, is probably one of the best examples I could have come up with. Was QTEs, quick time events. If you're not familiar with these, basically the way we see them in current games is you're in the middle of a cinematic and a big fight's going on that's outside of the mechanics of the game, and you have to push triangle when it tells you to push triangle, or else you fail the quick time event. You either die instantly in worst cases, or you have to redo the sequence, you get pushed back away from the monster because you failed it, and you have to reposition yourself or lower the monster's hit points again, or some kind of failure state that comes from missing the key press within the time frame that they give you. Quick time events have been around a little longer than I thought. I guess I think of it in modern sense, kind of like the example that I just gave. But if you really want to look at how you would describe a quick time event, some very basic elements of that, or at least the very earliest forms, I should say, are in games like Dragon's Lair, that old cartoon game where it was, let's be honest, it was basically you watching a movie, and it would say a door would light up, and you'd have to push up on the controller, and if you didn't go through the door, you'd be treated with a death animation, and then you had to do it again. That was the gameplay. That was 100% of the gameplay. You'd see a flash on the screen, you'd react with a button press or pushing the controller in a certain way. If you did it in time, you moved on. If you didn't, you lost. And it became a game of memorization because it never changed. So once you memorize everything, you just push the buttons when it told you to push them, and you'd automatically win. Very bare bones definition of what a video game would be, I think. Again, and more. The first time I really think quick time events, when I personally think when's the first time I really think, oh, this is a weird mechanic, was back in God of War 1, where you're fighting various creatures, specifically the hydras in the ship, where you'd get them so low, and then you'd hit O, and then that would start this cinematic sequence where you're pushing the keys at specific times, and you're slamming the hydra's head against the walls of the ship, doing damage. And at the time I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting, but I remember immediately being annoyed that, oh, if I missed this key press, I had to do this all over again. You didn't die most of the time, but you'd have to re-weaken the enemy to get them to that point, and until you completed that sequence, you couldn't move on. So in that sense, it was very annoying. QuickTime events, I think one of the big goals of QuickTime events is so that the designer can present something in the game that's intense, that's full of action, but at the same time make it so that you're not just watching a cutscene. It makes it feel like you're involved. For example, because I actually read up a little bit on this, previous examples of QuickTime events. One good example of this, I think, that was brought up was the Resident Evil 4, where Leon is talking with this guy and having a very heated conversation, and in between the conversation, he tries to attack you, and you have to fend him off. So it's kind of like conversation, attack with a quick time, and if you succeeded, you go back to the conversation, and you're kind of tense because he's going to attack you again, and you're just waiting for that quick time event. So in theory, that sounds good, right? If you've not played it, that sounds interesting because it's a quick time event, but you kind of feel like Leon, where you're kind of listening to what he's saying because he's giving you clues about what's going on, but at the same time, you have to look out for that attack that could come in any second and deflect it, or you're going to die. And if you did fail these quick time events, instant death. There was no, oh, you took a little bit of damage. You died and had to do the entire thing over again, which I think is one of the major flaws of this type of quick time event. Is you can get 4 or 5 steps in, you miss a key press, and now you have to do it all over again. And immediately it becomes frustrating because it's I have to listen to the same thing, look for the same key presses, and the key presses can change. And especially somebody like me who's a PC gamer, if I pick up a console and it's press X, and I'm like, wait a minute, am I on PlayStation or am I on Xbox? Which button is X? Or, even with the PlayStation, I forget which button's the square and things like that. So that can be frustrating in itself. And Newer games try to alleviate that by not just showing the button you need to press, but they'll put it like on a side of the screen. So for example, the Xbox's Y button is at the top of the controller. So if you need to press Y, it shows up at the top of the screen. So if you're not as familiar with the layout, you can say, oh, I just hit the top button. So they've made it better in that regard. And again, you know, a lot of developers use this. And again, it's another way for them to show you your character doing things that you can't present in gameplay. Again, kind of going back to the God of War example, where you're fighting that like the Hydra. During that fight, you like once the quick time event, like normally you're familiar with God of War, it's just an action game. And normally you're just, you know, smashing attack and dodging once in a while, and you're just flailing your chains about. So it's pretty standard stuff. But then when you kick into the quick time event, you're stabbing it and slamming it against the walls and jumping on top of it and running up its body and, you know, slamming it against the ceiling. Stuff that there's no way to really do within the gameplay engine. So that way you're doing this awesome stuff, but on one hand, it's not you just sitting back and going, okay, well, let me just watch myself do this stuff for 30 seconds to a minute. It's, oh, I'm actually doing it. But I think the problem that me and a lot of people have with QuickTime events is they're just not interesting to do. It becomes just like a kind of like a chore, and if you miss it, it's frustrating because now you have to do it again. And it's not a typical part of gameplay. It's just like a dumbed down version of Guitar Hero in a way, where you're just pressing the button, you know, press X to succeed, or I think I heard the expression, press X to live. And like I said, newer games are a bit better about not having a complete fail state where you miss the QuickTime event, you automatically lose. I think they've learned that, but for whatever reason, they still use QuickTime events. And honestly, the only people I've ever really heard defend QuickTime events are developers themselves. Say, oh no, well, you know, again, we want to give that cinematic experience, and but we don't want you to be bored by watching the cutscene. It's like, okay, well, if you have to throw in these QuickTime events to keep us interested in your cinematics, then I think that might be your problem. On one hand, you got to keep in mind, some players just don't care about cinematics. They just don't care about story. No matter what type of game they're playing, they're going to skip the cutscenes if they can, or they're only going to half listen, or they're going to be checking their phone or doing whatever. Trying to keep them interested by forcing them to push keys once in a while, or else they're going to have to listen to the whole thing again or face some other negative consequences. That's not going to really have the desired effect. The flip side is that people like me who actually do like watching cinematics, I do like hearing the backstory. I don't mind a reasonable amount of cinematics. I don't mind long cinematics. I get taken out of the game because I'm so focused on watching for that button press, especially if I'm playing on like a controller. I'm like more stressed out because I'm like, oh, well, I better make sure it's the right one, because otherwise, I don't know, I might hit the wrong button, and I definitely don't want to do this all over again. I don't want to listen to this all over again. So I'm not even really listening and paying attention to the cinematic because I'm looking out for that stupid QuickTime event to pop up. If you want my character to do awesome things, jumping over the enemies, slamming them around, and bouncing off the walls, fine, just show it. And please, for God's sakes, stop throwing QuickTime events in the middle of just random cinematics. Because once that starts, I'm kind of, I will get to the point where I will put the controller down to kind of sit back and enjoy the exposition. And all of a sudden, boom, like it's a button press. Oh crap, I'm like putting my hands back on the keyboard or picking up the gamepad again. It's like, I didn't even know there was going to be a damn QuickTime event. So please stop. The only QuickTime events that I wouldn't even know if I would, I guess you could consider this a QuickTime event. The only time I'm okay with them is in like action games like Bayonetta and Devil May Cry, where specifically actually, well, not Devil May Cry, but with Bayonetta, where you get the execution moves, and like depending on the execution move you're doing, you usually just end up mashing a button really quick. And even if you don't do it, it still works. I don't think you just do less damage, or maybe you get less rings or less halos. which are the currency in those games. So it's not really a real failure. You just don't get the full effect of it. I don't think it's possible to completely fail and then have some kind of negative consequence. And the execution button presses are always the same. If you do the guillotine, it's always Y. If you do the rack, it's always making circle motions with the controller. So you know what's coming. It's not mixing it up. And it can be kind of fun, especially with the fast button presses with Bayonetta. Like, the more you press it, the faster she'll like attack often, or turn, or do whatever it is that she's doing. So it can actually be kind of cool to see that reaction and try to get the max bonus by pressing as fast as you can. So that kind of stuff I don't mind. But otherwise, generally, no. I really am against QTEs. Again, I've never heard a player actually be like them. I've heard people that are neutral, but for the most part, whenever people talk about QTEs, quick time events, I find that people tend to be very negative about them. The next example is a game specific and very recent as well. The Batmobile in Arkham Knight. Now, if you've been watching my Let's Play here on youtube.com/Vertigo Tea Party, you're very aware of my feelings of the Batmobile. But if you're not familiar with the Arkham City series, or the Arkham series rather, there's been 4 games, 3 of them by Rocksteady, 1 of them by somebody else whose name escapes me right now. And up until now, you play as you might imagine, Batman, and you use your various gadgets, like ability to see people through walls. You've got explosives and batarangs and like a pull gun that you use to take enemies out in combat. Sometimes they have weapons, so you have to be very sneaky and take them out. And you have to use your detective mode to kind of figure out what was going on, figure out crimes, things like that nature. But with the Arkham City, they've introduced a little bit more open world, kind of like Arkham, or I think I said Arkham Knight. With Arkham Knight, they introduced the Batmobile, and like City, it's more free and open, like Arkham Asylum. And I didn't play Origins, but basically they wanted to give you the Batmobile, I guess, to drive around and to kind of complete that whole Batman feel, right? Because outside of Batman, one of the things that makes him so powerful and such a force to be reckoned with is not just his gadgets, but his machinery. The Batmobile, the Bat glider thing. Sorry, I'm not like that huge on Batman. I don't know what the flying Batmobile is called. But those things are kind of important to Batman. So I guess it was a natural evolution to say, okay, well, this time let's give him the Batmobile. And again, in theory, it doesn't sound like a bad idea. Now it's the new thing that Batman has access to in the new game. You can drive around. You can, take criminals out you can now add criminals that are in vehicles. You can take them down. You can, use it to deal with enemies that Batman would have no other way to deal with because of armor and all this other stuff. So it seems like, okay, that's not a bad idea. I mean, there could be some interesting things that comes with it. And the thing is, it's not really the Batmobile itself in Arkham Knight that's the problem. It feels like it handles very well, almost too well, especially in tank mode. You could easily replace the model of the Arkham tank with like a human character and replace like the little dodge it has with like a human roll dodge, and it would handle pretty much like a person. It's very weird. And it's kind of obvious that they made the Batmobile very forgiving in its handling. You can slam into like a pillar, like a cement pillar at full speed, and it just crumbles into dust and barely affects your speed if you're going fast enough. And it's kind of funny to see these like pillars and things that are supposed to be very solid get completely demolished by the Batmobile, and the Batmobile just barely even flinch. So they try to be very forgiving, I think, because it's just the racing or the driving of the car is supposed to be kind of an add-on. And a lot of people who play these types of games, myself included, don't really do a lot of the car driving / tank using, or don't play those types of games. So I think they intentionally were very forgiving with how easily the Batmobile is to handle. The problem with the Batmobile is how often it was used. Up until now, when you play these games, again, you deal with the combat, taking out multiple unarmed thugs in single combat, taking out 15 guys, with your counter moves and pulling off these awesome like gadget moves in the middle of combat, or taking out armed thugs who have guns. You have to be very sneaky and sneak around and take them out, flying over the city. All that feels very much like Batman. But the problem is they forced the use of the Batmobile so much that it took away from the game, where it feels like half the game you're playing the Batmobile, not Batman. The problem is the Batmobile became the sidekick in this game. I've heard people even call this Arkham Knight Batmobile the game, because you use it so much. And I definitely think it's the number one criticism that game gets and deserves. Because it's just, again, it's not the element of the Batmobile. The Batmobile was implemented in such a way that you don't have to be great with driving controls or tank controls to get by with it. There's just far too much that requires it. Both in the story missions, you're constantly having to take out tanks with your Batmobile, or use the Batmobile to pull down this piece of structure so that you can drive across it, or you're having to race against these other vehicles. It's just constant forced usage, or using it to power up things. It's just ridiculous. It's like, yes, we get it. You spent a lot of time and money developing the Batmobile, and you're going to make us use it. I think the better way to have done the Batmobile is, yes, have a few, maybe a couple times where you're having to race down enemy vehicles to knock them off the road, to interrogate them. Have a few tank battles here and there, a few other times. But otherwise, just let me drive the Batmobile if I want to. Because sometimes, even though I hated the Batmobile, sometimes I would just drive it around the city just for the hell of it. Even though gliding around was much faster, driving it just for fun was actually pretty enjoyable. But when you're forcing me to do it, it stops being fun, especially when you're forcing me to do it over and over and over and over again. That's when it loses its luster. So I think the takeaway from that is, if you're going to implement some kind of mechanic like this in a game with players are expecting gameplay to be one thing, and you're adding this new thing, which should be a cool addition, but yet you almost make it center stage, now it becomes a problem. Don't make these add-ons that are, again, supposed to enhance the experience of the game. Don't let them become the center of the show. And I'm over exaggerating when I say 50% of the game is the Batmobile, but it feels like it is. As a player, it feels like it is. Hell, if you look at the virtual challenges, I think half of them, or maybe even more than half of them, involve the Batmobile. That is ridiculous in a Batman game. And I don't think there's too many people who wanted that. And the dislike of the Batmobile, I've heard, is almost universal. I've heard very few people defend the overuse of the Batmobile. So I think this is another great example where you think, oh, cool, the Batmobile, another tool in the Batman arsenal, but it wears out its welcome very quickly when it's forced down your throat over and over again. Next up is probably either my favorite example of this or my second favorite behind QTEs. The example is the Diablo 3 auction house. Now, I think this is a fantastic idea, or I'm sorry, a fantastic example of an idea that sounds good, but it just turns out poor. Now, there's a few reasons it turned out poor. We'll go into that. But to start off, if you've played Diablo 1 and 2, you know that trading with other players was a pain. Like, you had to look for trade chat. There would be chat names about trading, or maybe trading specific items. You'd have to go in there, and at least, I don't know if they ever fixed, it's been a long time since I've played Diablo 2. But I know in Diablo 1, you just had to drop the item on the ground and hope the other person doesn't steal it. So then you'd have to like do things where you would stand far apart from each other and you'd both drop your item on the ground and then you'd walk past each other to go get it to make sure somebody wasn't going to steal it. You know, stupid things like that. And just trading was grossly inefficient. And I'm sure there are people out there who love that kind of thing, going through and digging through the different chat channels and finding a great deal and then reselling it. I don't doubt that those people exist, but I think most people don't want to go through that bother just to buy and sell items. And the Diablo series, a big part of its attraction is the whole item grind, right? Getting the better items, getting that really awesome new weapon or shield or helm or whatever it is, or get that last item of that green item set that you've really wanted. So, you know, being able to get that without just grinding the same area over and over and over and over again is appealing. And making that entire process easier sounds like a great idea. So how else would you do that? But with the current thing we see a lot these days is an auction house where you throw your items up. You say, oh, I found this item. It's really good for a monk, but I'm playing a wizard. So I'm going to put it on the auction house for X amount of gold. And that sells. I was like, okay, cool. Well, now I've got the money. I can buy my awesome two-handed staff of ass-whoopery that I've been wanting, and it just will not drop for me. I can search for it. Oh, look, somebody's got it for sale, and I buy it. Cool, now I have that staff. I think it's in theory, that sounds like a great idea, especially in games like Diablo, where, again, gearing up is a big part of it. And I'm not even going to touch on the real life auction house part, or real life money auction house, the one where you could actually put items up and sell or buy them with real life, like real money. I'm not going to touch on that a whole lot because I think that was part of the problem or part of what caused the issues with some of the auction house, but I don't think that was the main issue. You could have taken that away and left everything else the same, and I still think those problems would have existed. So let's go and let's look at how it was implemented and let's look at why it turned out to be just terrible. I don't think that this is an interesting example, I think, because the auction house itself, I don't think was a terrible idea. I think a big part of the problem was the complete randomness of the item. So if I'm playing a witch doctor, I can clear all of an act, and the items that drop could be just anything. Like it could be wizard related, monk. It could be like a plate helm with ridiculous stats, or and the stats were all weird if I remember correctly too. Again, it's been a while since I played Diablo 3 at release. But 99% of the stuff you picked up was junk. To be fair, the other Diablos were often like that as well, where, you know, most of the items you picked up probably weren't that great, but you got, until you were at like the top higher end, right, where you were really grinding items, you got a decent amount of upgrades at a fairly good pace, right? You weren't getting a new upgrade every 5 minutes or whatever, but it felt like if you played for a few hours, you'd probably get a couple good upgrades within there, and obviously a few levels as well, but you'd get a couple upgrades here and there, again, until you get to the very top of the ladder, so to speak, and you're just looking for that one item that has slightly better stats or whatever. So to some extent, yes, that's to be expected. But I think overall, just the items were just so bad overall. And I think one of the reasons that the item drops were designed that way, honestly, was possibly because of the real life auction house. So I'm playing the game and I can't get squat that's good for my class. I could possibly go and spend money on buying some decent items. Now I don't think that was ever confirmed or anything like that, but you know, that's speculations I've made and I've heard other people make as well. But regardless of any speculation, the fact was typically you might get upgrades or they might be side grades even after hours of playing. And then I remember playing and then like for a few levels and I'm like, you know, I'm getting upgrades, but I'm putting on this as a witch doctor. I put this helmet on because it had good intelligence, but it has like strength on it too, but it was better than the other really crappy thing that I was wearing. So it was like the upgrades I was getting were very blah. and just not very interesting at all. But then I remember it's like, oh, you know what? They have that auction house in. When that, like, after a few levels, I started checking the auction house. I avoided the auction at first because I thought, probably everybody's charging, out the nose for all these items, especially right out of the start gate. People tend to, when things like this are first implemented, tend to put items up at ridiculous prices and nobody buys them. And eventually it lowers. So I kind of waited for that to pass. So when I did check the auction house, I was like, whoa, I'm like, I can buy all these much, much better items for nothing, like very little in-game money. I never bothered to check the real life auction house other than just out of curiosity. I was never going to buy items with real money in Diablo. But I was like, wow, I can't believe these great items are so cheap. So I would just basically fill out my entire inventory with stuff I bought from the auction house. And then I would sell the other stuff that was halfway decent on the auction house and other people would buy it. And I ended up with a fairly decent amount of gold. And after a while, you start to realize, and of course, now that I've got really nice items, nothing dropping is worth a damn. Like, it's not even really worth looking at most of the time because 99% of the time, it was not very good. Even if you got a yellow item, like a higher tier item, like a yellow item, you look at it and it's like, oh, well, this is a monk item, or this is a barbarian item or something. Well, this is worthless. You put it on the auction house to sell it. That's what most of the good drops were for other classes. So you end up selling them to buy the stuff that you actually wanted. And what happened after a while is you start to realize is like almost all, or hell, even everything I'm wearing is from the auction house. Nothing I have on me, or very little that I'm using, is stuff that I found from bosses or just random drops or doing events or quests or whatever. And again, in a game like Diablo, where part of the fun is getting those new upgrades from killing monsters or doing quests or whatever, this really sucked a lot of the life out of the game. Because you're just basically running dungeons to make money to buy stuff off the auction house. And, and I'm not even going to pretend I understand the psychology of all this. But I think it's worth noting, or at least I'm sure somebody somewhere would like to delve into this deeper, about how either way you get the item, right? The ultimate staff of badassery, right? Whether I get it from a random drop or whether I get it from buying it in the auction house, some people probably won't care. But I think a lot of people buying it from the auction house with money I made from questing or from selling other items isn't as fulfilling as getting it from a boss or a random monster drop. On a completely logical level, that seems very bizarre because one, you're getting the nice sweet upgrade. Two, if you get it from a drop, it's just random. It's purely luck. Obviously excluding any kind of specific items that specific monsters drop. It's 100% luck, whether you get it or not. You might go out and get it the first time. You might do it 1,000 times and not get the item. Versus, again, taking those items and that you found and sold in the auction house for gold, or just taking the actual gold you get from killing monsters and buying it, you still obtain it, and getting it from the auction house is 100% deal, right? You're not going to spend the money and maybe not get it. But for whatever reason, in our human brains, it feels more fulfilling for a lot of us to get it from that tough boss, or even just a random creature drops it. It feels more satisfying to get it that way. So putting stuff on the auction house took that feeling away and pushed people away from the game, myself included. And I don't even consider myself that big of an item whore. I like Diablo I like killing hordes of monsters and coming up with creative builds or even creative, just fun builds to wipe out throngs of monsters. But the item collection is part of my enjoyment of those types of games. And the auction house really took that away. And, there's other factors at play here. It's not just the auction house. I'd be curious to see, obviously later on, Diablo or Blizzard did fix a lot of the item drop issues so that you would but you would almost exclusively get items that were good for your class when an enemy dropped them, like when you killed an enemy and they dropped. So that, and they made some other changes too. But the short version is, you got stuff that was good for your class and you got upgrades more often. Now, I think it's possible at that point to have kept the auction house, because then you're at least getting some upgrades, and maybe like there's a few spots you're just really unlucky, like boots or gloves, like you just can't get a good drop. Then you go to the auction house and buy it. Now, I think that would be an interesting experiment, to leave the item drop as it is, but also take out the real life money auction house, but leave the regular auction house. I'd be curious how that would work. I mean, it still does take away part of the joy of going at your own items. You could easily fix that by making like the best items no drop. So basically you can't trade them, or no trade, I guess, in non-EverQuest terms, so that you just couldn't trade them with anyone. You could do that, but I don't have a problem with them taking the auction house out. And, if you've, kind of as a side note here, if you've given up on Diablo after release, absolutely try it again. I was one of the people who said, when Blizzard started to acknowledge the problems that were with the release and said they were going to fix it, I was one of the people who said, well, that's great that you care, but this isn't going to fix itself. Activision's not going to let them change what they need to change. It's going to take a major, major overhaul to the item system. It's not going to happen. It's great they care, but it's just not going to happen. I was wrong. They absolutely made it way better with the patches to the item drops and with the Reaper of Souls, and they continue to do things that, make farming the gear more interesting and more fun. So they did actually come back and fix a lot of the problems that they caused with not just the introduction of the auction house, but with the systems that kind of necessitated an auction house in the first place. That being that the vast majority of the items that you got were crap. But yes, again, the Diablo 3 auction house, another a great example, in my opinion, of something that sounded good in theory, but when implemented turned out to not be good at all. Another mechanic I want to talk about, and this mechanic might be one which when I describe it, you think, oh, that sounds awful even in theory. But I think once you understand the theory, it makes a lot more sense. But again, in practice, people really did not like it. That mechanic was group experience debt sharing in EverQuest 2. EverQuest 2, obviously, massive multiplayer game, sequel to EverQuest, as you might have guessed. When it first came out, when you died, you didn't lose experience per se, but you had experience debt. So what that would mean is, like, let's say you needed 1,000 experience to go from level 10 to 11. But let's say you died. Well, you'd get an experience debt that said, okay, well, you don't lose experience. You were still at 0 experience of level 10. But now you have a little bit of a debt. So half of your experience goes off to paying this debt until it's paid off. And then you go back to earning full experience. And keeping in mind, those of you who haven't really played MMOs until WoW or something like that, keep in mind experience loss at the time was not unusual at all. In EverQuest 1, you lost experience. You can even lose a level from dying if you've lost too much experience, which was not terribly uncommon. But it was a fairly common mechanic to be used around the time. Obviously, WoW never really had it, and they both came out within months of each other, that being EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft. But it was not a crazy idea at the time. And the idea being you're punished for death, right? Some kind of penalty for dying, so you're not just like, oh, well, I died, let me pick up my stuff and move on again. So that it would be a little bit more, you maybe be a little more cautious about that. So that was experience debt. Shared experience debt was such that if you were in a group and one person died, so let's say we're in a group and there's 4 of us, and I'm just going to say 4 because the math is easier for me. You die in this group of 4 people. So instead of you taking 100% of the debt, each member of the party gets 25% of whatever that debt. So let's say if you had 1,000 experience debt normally that you would have, 1,000 XP debt you would have normally had to pay off. Now each member of the party instead gets to 150 experience debt. So you might be thinking, well, that's insane. Like, why on earth should I get an experience penalty just because this other person in the party died? Again, keep in mind, this is a different type of MMO and a different generation of MMOs. Certain classes, and I get, obviously some of this is still true today, but certain classes, especially in games like EverQuest and EverQuest 2, were just naturally more dangerous and more prone to dying than others. In EverQuest 1, I can tell you as an enchanter, it was far more likely for me to die in a party than almost anyone else, other than maybe a monk, if depending on luck and things like that. Without getting into details, just the way the class plays, you often tended to die fairly often, depending on the scenario. Old school EverQuest people know what I'm talking about. But even if you're doing your job right, or hell, even because you're doing your job right, you might die, and there's not really a whole lot you could do about it. So those classes, again, in EverQuest 1, just kind of sucked it up, right? You just kind of had to deal with it. That you died and the party lived because of what you did, and they would resurrect you and you would just move on with your life. So the idea with EverQuest 2 is like, okay, so you have these classes. It's not really fair that this class is going to be losing a lot of experience into XP debt just because they're doing what they're supposed to be, or the cleric didn't heal them because they were watching TV, or the warrior wasn't properly tanking, or whatever. It's not fair that this person sucks up that experience loss. So let's spread it amongst the party so that you either, the idea is you succeed together, and that if you win, you get the spoils of the victory, the experience, the items, all that. So you should also share in loss. So it shouldn't just be one person shouldering the burden of loss. And keeping in mind too, and again, especially in these types of games, the way MMOs were then, if you died, it wasn't necessarily your fault. It wasn't, oh, you stood in the red circle too long and you died because you're an idiot and you can't pay attention. Again, you could be doing your job and somebody else doesn't do their job and you die, and now you've got the experience debt that you have to deal with. So the idea was you would work more cohesively, you would pay more attention and make sure to do your job properly, because you didn't want to deal with that experience debt because you're the tank and you weren't paying attention, and a second mob wandered into camp and is beating the crap out of your wizard and they get killed. So theoretically, you're going to be paying more attention because you don't want that to happen. Obviously, you should be doing that anyway if you're a tank in a group, but you get what I'm going for here. So that was the idea. And I was probably like you when you first heard that. I was like, wow, that sounds like a terrible idea. I thought the same thing. But once I kind of thought about it and listened to, the reasoning behind it, I thought, okay, this is actually not terrible. I think this could work. And again, and I can't stress this enough, MMOs were different at the time in many ways. Communities were different. And don't get me wrong, there was still plenty of really terrible communities. But I feel like overall the communities were, we'll say, different back then. So I thought that it was a decent idea. And especially if you're grouping with people you know, I think, like if I had my old EverQuest 1 group and, they wouldn't have a problem with a little bit of shared experience debt as opposed to the cleric or me dying because we were doing our job or we sacrificed ourselves so that the rest of the party could escape, what have you. So I thought it was all right. Let's see how this works. However, a lot of people just ended up just really, really hating the idea, because you might have, somebody who's wandering off and get themselves killed, or, again, tank is, not paying attention and he doesn't really care about his XP debt. So people are dying in the party. But, it just, a lot of people really didn't like it. It was not well received at all. I played EverQuest 2 a little bit, keeping in mind it came out like 2 or 3 months before World of Warcraft. And of course that sucked me in like no other. But most people just really were not big fans of it. I don't really know. I mean, I had to do some digging just to find, I had to do some digging just to find the name of it. The group XP Debt Sharing. Because it's been so long, because they've since removed it. They removed it back in like 2005 or something like that, 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. Like a year or two after the game came out, I believe. But yeah, it was not well received at all. People, let's be honest, people are very selfish generally. And especially if you've played MMOs with people these days. You know the type, the DPS who throws all their damage down immediately and gets aggro and gets killed. And one blames the tank for not grabbing aggro, and two blames the healer for not healing him while he's wearing while this DPS person is wearing cloth and getting beat on by two high level creatures because he pulled aggro. It's everybody's fault but theirs, right? So I think that was probably a large part of the problem as well with that debt sharing thing. Was that, oh, well, this person died, it's not my fault, why do I have to deal with it? And to an extent, you could argue that, well, what would the DPS do to have saved this person from dying? And a lot of times the answer was not really a whole lot. And of course, again, you're going to get those really bad people who just keep dying because they are playing badly, and you want to kick them out of the group, which is itself going to cause hostilities with both the group, because now they have the experience debt, and the person getting kicked out because, of course, they think they're doing fine or whatever, and then they blame the XP debt system. So it was just a big, people just did not like it. And again, I still don't think it's a terrible idea, but generally in MMO communities, especially these days, it would not fly at all. These last two mentions are kind of honorable mention type things. I don't know if I would say that they necessarily were bad in implementation, but I think, well, you'll see as I talk about them. The first one I want to talk about is in BioShock 1, you had the research camera. And with the research camera, you could take pictures of the various enemies like the splicers, the big daddies, etc. And the more pictures you took, you gain experience from that. And I think there was like 5 different levels. And as you progress through the levels, you would get damage boosts versus that type of enemy, or you get a special plasmid or something along those lines. And it was interesting in that taking pictures of them like while they're attacking or doing specific things, or if you can get multiple in the same shot at the same time, you get bonus experience to level that research camera up faster. Or, well, you weren't leveling up the camera, you were leveling up your experience in those creatures or something like that. But at any rate, it was interesting in that you were trying to kind of obviously survive, but at the same time get these pictures so that you could do more damage against these guys, so that later on you could just take them out a lot faster. And of course, unlock those special plasmids. And again, I don't think this is necessarily bad implementation. It was kind of interesting to use, but I think it hurts in a few ways. One, it was kind of an interruption in the flow of combat, in that you're like, oh, I need to get pictures of these guys so that I can get this experience. So you try to get them to attack you, and you're trying to take the picture so that you can. It's just a weird to be thinking about in this first person shooter. You're trying to take pictures of your enemies while they're attacking you, and trying to get as many in the frame as you can, just so that you can build up your knowledge of them so that you do more damage. It's just kind of a weird flow breaker. Also, if you I'm doing a replay of the game, if you wanted to play through it again, it would start to get a little monotonous trying to have to take pictures of all the enemies through a second playthrough. That you at the point you'd probably just be like, you know what, screw it. I might take a few to get the first level or two. Other than that, I'll just deal with them because I kind of know how to deal with them now, and I don't need the damage bonus. And of course, the camera was fully optional. You didn't have to use it, other than I think maybe once or twice to have them, through the tutorial part where they show you how it works. Other than that, it was completely optional. You could skip it. And I don't remember hearing a whole lot of complaints about it. And for the most part, I enjoyed it. But I do think, like I say, it started to get a bit monotonous once you just were spending a lot of your time trying to take the perfect picture of, getting them in the action shots and all that. And of course, like I said, you don't have to, but there's that weird compulsion that it's there and you want to max it out. You want to max out splicers. You want to max out big daddies. And of course, the extra damage sure as hell doesn't hurt. So you're going to kind of force yourself to use it anyway. So I think that did hurt in a way, mildly. Of course, BioShock 1 was still a phenomenal game. But I do think it hurt a little bit. And if I could change anything about BioShock 1, it would probably be to either take the camera out or make it so that you just got more experience, or maybe just less levels like maybe 3 levels, but you got bigger damage boosts, something like that. So it wasn't being used as much because to be fair, it's been a long time since I've played BioShock 1. But I remember using it a fairly decent amount before you'd finally max out the experience with that certain type of enemy. And of course, when you fight a new type of enemy, it'd be start all over again, right? Because you'd have to be taking pictures of them and try to avoid getting killed at the same time. So I would use that as a weaker, not so solid example of something that was in a game that in theory sounded interesting, but in practice didn't turn out quite as fun. And of course, they did end up taking the camera out. I'm pretty sure BioShock 2 didn't have the camera. Pretty sure. I think it might have had it in multiplayer or something. But anyway, that's another example. The last example is kind of an odd one. It's the idea of having long downtime / long travel time in MMOs, massive multiplayer games. If you played EverQuest, and if you followed things like the early development of Vanguard and eventually Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen, I think it was called, there's a lot about long travel times there. Again, if you've played EverQuest, you're familiar with the run through the Karanas, right? Where you've got to run through, like South and West Karana to get through like some major zones. And we're talking, 15, 20-minute run? And this is not counting the boats. Boats in EverQuest you would have to wait, especially the boat to Kunark was awful. You'd have to wait sometimes 10 to 15 minutes for a boat. You'd get on the boat, and then you'd ride the boat for another 10 to 15 minutes. And I think I'm being conservative. I think some of these boat rides were longer just to get where you were going. So if I wanted to go to Kunark and I just happened to be at the dock and I just missed a boat, you're talking about 30 minutes just to get to the dock of the other area. That's not including the time that you would have to run to that dock if you weren't just sitting at it, and you probably weren't. And on the other side, once you get to your destination by boat, running to wherever your true final destination is. So you're reasonably talking sometimes about an hour of travel time. Now, obviously, there were some classes, druids and wizards specifically in EverQuest 1, that could teleport you to get you closer. Sometimes you'd still have to run 10 to 15 minutes, but at least that would get you closer if you could find one that would be willing to take you wherever you were going, which often they would charge you for, which is fair enough. I mean, you're taking time out of their schedule to come find you and then teleport you and then go back to whatever it was that they were doing. But excluding that, travel time is something that in theory can sound good, right? So I know when Vanguard, and to a lesser extent, I think Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen, or whatever it was, the other Brad McQuaid Kickstarter game that he was I think he's still going to make it. But regardless, they talked a lot about travel times. And with Vanguard, originally, I remember they talked about having, like, if you wanted to travel from one end of the continent to the other, there wasn't let me just turn on auto run and run through this area for 30 minutes, which is, let's be honest, that's what you ended up doing with like the Karanas back in EverQuest 1. You would get like a traveling party together, and you would go in a caravan to get across, and of course you'd run into adventures along the way, things that were unexpected, that crazy emergent gameplay that will pop up during excursions like this. And so they wanted to make travel meaningful. They wanted to make the world seem large. So one big way of doing that is, of course, making it take a very long time to get from one area to another. And I think there is definitely there's value to that. There's value to making the world seem massive. There's a value to making it feel like going from one place to another is a significant decision to make. It's not just, I'm in Augermore, I need to go to the other side of the world, I'll be there in like 5 minutes, right? It's, this is going to take me about an hour to get over there. I think there's definitely value to that. But I don't know if outside of a very niche market, people would really be interested in that. First of all, again, going back to EverQuest 1, people talk about, oh yeah, it was so scary running from the Karanas or through the Karanas or running through Kithakor Forest at night. Oh, it was so scary. And, there's so many stories of, having to do a corpse retrieval or running into something or finding some friends, all these interesting stories that tend to pop up. And yes, I have my fond memories of things like that. I remember being scared of running through Kithakor Forest at night, which, if you're not familiar, it's, long story short, Kithakor Forest in EverQuest was this forest that by day was not really a big deal. You just run through it and you're done. At night, however, like all these high level nasty undead would spawn. So you either just had to wait until day or be very careful. But here's the thing, and people seem to forget this about Kithakor. All you had to do was running around the zone walls, right? If you just hugged the zone walls all the way around, you were safe 99% of the time. Karanas were the same in that, the first few times I ran through Karanas, I was blown away. Keeping in mind, this was my first MMO, but it's like, wow, it's massive. There's so much land. There's so many creatures I need to look out for and so many things to see. Well, there's not really that many things to see, but you get what I'm saying, right? It just felt massive as I'm making this huge journey to get to my destination for whatever reason I was going over there. Second and third time, still pretty cool. Fifth, sixth, seventh, 10th, 20th, 30th time, you know what you would do? Hit numlock to auto run, alt tab out, and then on occasion flip back into the game and make sure you didn't run into a tree or that you weren't getting chased by a wolf or something along those lines. So they just became boring and tedious most of the time. Yes, I have my stories that I'll take to my grave that I remember about long travel times and boat rides that take 20 minutes with a vast ocean. I totally, I get that. But the question, I guess, is that one or two stories that come from this worth hours and hours and hours of tedious travel, of alt tabbing out to, while you auto run to get where you're going, or you're auto following somebody else, or whatever it is that you're doing? Is that really what you want? Is that really what you want to deal with? The boring, because that's the thing, the romanticized parts of these long travel times, again, feeling like the world's large, those cool stories that come up on occasions during your long story travels, those get romanticized because but they're very different from the standard experience of doing that, because typically it's very boring to run that far just to get where you're going. And of course, there's a whole side thing of, once I get where I'm going, what if there's no reason for me to be here? So for example, let's say I'm at this dungeon, but there's nobody here, and there's not really any other dungeons that are close to my level over here. It's like, okay, well, the other dungeon that's close to my level is way on the other side of the world. If I have to run an hour over there and then find there's nobody there, I'm going to be pretty annoyed and frustrated that I've wasted all this time. And obviously there's ways around this. And I'm not totally against a game that is more, again, for a niche market that has like longer travel times and experience death and all of that. But I think it's a very small market of people, especially these days, that will tolerate it. I tolerated it in EverQuest because, one, it was my first MMO, and two, it was really the best and all there was at the time. There wasn't too much competition. You had like Anarchy Online, Dark Age of Camelot. Not a heck of a lot of competition, and not a lot of good competition, at least. Dark Age of Camelot I've heard was good, but I never got a chance to try it. Regardless, nowadays, obviously people expect you to be able to travel quickly. They want mounts, if not flying mounts, being able to teleport or ride a griffin. I always thought the griffin thing was the ideal, right? Because you have to go there once, and once you go there, you learn it. So you still have to get there. You still have to make that trip. But now when I want to go back, I don't have to do the tedium of running along. And again, I'm just going to alt tab out. I'm going to look at my phone, or I'm going to alt tab out and have Netflix on another screen, or read a web page, or do whatever it is I'm doing. I'm not going to really be enjoying the game. I'm just dealing with the tedium of going from one place to another. So it's one of those things, again, I think in theory, like, yeah, you get behind the idea of getting a few of your buddies together. It's like, yeah, or, we're going to make a road trip, a medieval road trip across the country, and we have to prep, and, we'll see what adventures we get into along the way, and we'll have some stories to tell in the future to tell our nerdy kids or our cyber kids or our cyber grandkids. And then, there's interest to that, but in practice, I just don't think there's a lot of market for that. And like I said, that's not really a fantastic example because the caravan thing, I don't think ever really happened in Vanguard. If I recall, I don't think they had anything along those lines. And I don't know how much travel was really talked about in the Kickstarter for Rise of the Fallen or whatever it was. I keep forgetting the name. I should have looked it up ahead of time, but regardless, I think it's something that it's not going to appeal to a very large market at all. So that was my tea time today, talking about, again, ideas that in theory seem interesting, but turn out to be either subpar or in some cases flat out bad. Thanks again to Gage for the idea and for his support on Patreon. If you guys have some other ideas, I'm always willing to listen. Definitely post them in the comments section below, or of course let me know what you thought. Also, let me know of other examples of games that you think had ideas that sounded good in theory but turned out bad in practice. It was actually tougher than I thought to come up with ideas. I asked a few people on Twitter, I did some Google searches, and pretty much all the examples I came up with are ones that I just kind of thought about myself. But yeah, I guarantee there's other games out there like this that, or even like QTEs isn't just a game; it affects a lot of games. I bet there's a lot of ideas like that are being used that people just aren't crazy about. So anyway, that's enough rambling for now. Thank you guys for listening, and thanks again to Gage. Make sure to follow me on Twitter as well, folks, and I will see you next time.